¿Vamos? Buenos días a todas y todos. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a esta jornada en torno al análisis institucional de la banca central, el cual hemos organizado en conjunto con el profesor Ignacio Chapacase a partir de nuestros Fondesit respectivos, y también aprovechando de celebrar el verdadero centenario del Banco Central de Chile, que abrió sus puertas el 11 de enero de 1926, ¿no? Hemos estado celebrando el centenario del Banco Central por ya un tiempo, pero la verdad que lo que se celebra es los 100 años de la primera ley que lo constituye. Como se va a, yo creo que discutir a lo largo de estos 2 días, esta institución ha cumplido diferentes roles de promoción del desarrollo como prestamista de última instancia, y en últimas décadas también especialmente se es preocupado del control de la inflación y de la estabilidad financiera. A nivel comparado, luego de la gran crisis financiera y la crisis económica generada por la pandemia COVID-19, los supuestos del paradigma de este diseño institucional de la banca central independiente, que se ha extendido en general a lo largo de distintas jurisdicciones, han sido controvertidos, ¿no? O sea, los supuestos en los que se basa este diseño son controvertidos. Las políticas monetarias no convencionales, así como las medidas que se impulsan para hacer frente al cambio climático, desafían la naturaleza técnica y la neutralidad que se le ha atribuido a la política monetaria. Pensamos que en este contexto el análisis de esta importante institución requiere de una aproximación interdisciplinaria, donde convergen las disciplinas del derecho, especialmente el derecho público, la ciencia política, la sociología y la economía política. Por ello, uno de los paneles de esta jornada está dedicado especialmente al análisis de la corriente del derecho económico, el derecho y la economía política, o Law and Political Economy en inglés, que ha surgido como un movimiento que contraviene el análisis normativo del derecho público y constitucional. En ese panel contaremos con la asistencia remota del profesor Jamie Modud, quien recientemente ha publicado el libro The Legal Foundations of Capitalism, The End of Laissez-faire, en signo de interrogación. También contamos con la presentación del libro de Andrés Solimano y Gabriela Zapata Román, Neoliberalismo a la chilena, una perspectiva histórica. Esperamos que en conjunto podamos generar un espacio que permita conectar perspectivas desde el derecho, la ciencia política, la economía, para analizar estas instituciones y avanzar colectivamente en la comprensión de los desafíos que enfrenta la banca central, especialmente en economías emergentes y en contextos democráticos. Pero también ahora pensar en esta nueva etapa de incertidumbre radical a la que nos ha arrastrado las políticas de Estados Unidos. Bien, Ignacio, los voy a dejar. Bueno, primero también quiero saludar especialmente al director del Departamento de Derecho Público que nos acompaña, Ramón Huidobro. Gracias, director, por estar.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Buenos días. Yo solamente quiero añadir algo muy corto a lo que dice Paula. Primero, darle la bienvenida a todos ustedes, agradecerles por estar acá, por darse el tiempo de estar con nosotros. Y este seminario se enmarca un esfuerzo que estamos haciendo ya hace varios años, con Paula y con otros colegas que están acá, de establecer una red colaborativa y de trabajo en torno a la banca central en América Latina y en la periferia, ¿ya? Entonces hay colegas de Alemania, de Brasil, de Estados Unidos, México, que por ciertas circunstancias hoy no pueden estar, pero sí participan de este esfuerzo colectivo, y aquí ya estamos viendo los primeros frutos. Así que le damos las gracias al director del Departamento de Derecho Público, a Jamie, a Andrés, a José Miguel. Y aquí justamente, esto, aunque somos poquitos, pues esto es un tema de nicho, ¿no es cierto?, muy específico, muy técnico, pero representa un poco el espíritu que hay de la diversidad que queremos darle al encuentro. Hay estudiantes más jóvenes, estudiantes más senior, hay investigadores junior, senior, y también colegas, ¿no es cierto?, de amplia experiencia como Andrés, que nos interesa mucho escucharlo, aprender su experiencia y un poco iluminar nuestras nuevas rutas de investigación en torno a lo que ellos han observado ya durante décadas de trabajo. Así que eso es lo que queremos también impulsar, este diálogo entre generaciones, ¿no es cierto?, respetuoso, pero también crítico. Así que le agradezco nuevamente su presencia acá. Le hemos puesto harto cariño a organizar este encuentro, hemos cuidado cada detalle, así que esperamos que lo disfruten y los instamos a que participen con las preguntas, en la discusión, en forma bien libre y relajada. La idea es pasarlo bien, estamos todos estresados con cierre de año, ¿no es cierto?, con incertidumbre de lo que estamos viendo hoy día, entonces que en estos 2 días tenga un espacio de reflexión relajado y de confianza, ¿ya? Y finalmente creo que el timing del seminario no podría haber sido mejor, ¿no es cierto? Ayer nos enteramos de que Trump está impulsando una investigación criminal en contra de Powell, el presidente de la Fed, lo que por supuesto pone en entredicho la idea de neutralidad, porque básicamente eso está motivado por la negativa de Powell y de su gente de, ¿no es cierto?, de agachar el moño, dicho en buen chileno, frente a las imposiciones que ha hecho Trump o ha intentado hacer Trump respecto a la política monetaria de la Fed. Así que, nada, tenemos todo para hacer un buen encuentro y los dejo de nuevo con Paula. Muchas gracias de nuevo por estar acá.
Gracias, Ignacio. Bueno, para el inicio de esta jornada tenemos el honor de contar con la charla magistral del profesor asociado de Sciences Po, Peter Augustine van Maleken. Peter va a hacer la presentación en inglés, vamos a pasarnos a ese idioma. Peter Augustine studied law, philosophy and economics at the universities of Namur and Leuven, at the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics, as well as his SJD from Harvard Law School. He was a Max Planck Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public and International Law in Heidelberg, and he's the principal investigator of the European Research Council Starting Grant Fed Money on the law and politics of money. Peter, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Or should I? Can everybody hear me? Is it better with or? Oh, okay, for the Zoom it's.
And
Pues muchas gracias por esa presentación tan generosa. Es un gran honor para mí tener la oportunidad de dirigirme a ustedes, a una audiencia tan distinguida, y quisiera agradecer muy especialmente a Ignacio Chabacase y a Paula Ahumada por brindarme la oportunidad de estar con ustedes hoy. Conocí a Paula Ahumada hace algunos años y ella me ha enseñado mucho sobre la rica historia económica, jurídica, política y ideológica también de la Banca Central en América Latina y en Chile en particular. Me encanta de tener la oportunidad de aprender mucho más de ustedes hoy y mañana. Es una alegría poder explorar con ustedes cuestiones de Banca Central 100 años después del nacimiento del Banco Central de Chile, especialmente en un momento tan crucial de la historia. También les debo una disculpa, como pueden notar mi español es demasiado elemental para permitirme intervenir en español y por eso les ofrezco mis disculpas. So, I would like to talk to you today about central banks and the core periphery problem. The topic of this conference in many ways is law and political economy of central banks in Latin America. And I believe that the core periphery problem, as developed amongst others by Raul Prebisch, is one of the key contributions of Latin America to the study of law and political economy that has marked the discipline in many ways and continues to do so. The core periphery problem is a key element of dependency theory. It argues, of course, that money flows typically from a marginalized periphery towards a core that keeps enriching itself. I believe, nevertheless, that there's a black spot somewhere in the core periphery theory, and that ultimately this theory of dependency has or foresees a rather limited role for money in and of itself. So of course, money typically reinforces the core periphery problem in that typically at the periphery, The currencies of peripheral countries are at the bottom of what is called the currency hierarchy. And Katarina Pistor published an article a few years ago in which she made the argument that plainly, although technically, formally, many countries can be considered to have monetary sovereignty. In practice, only very few countries have actual monetary sovereignty. Obviously, the United States, with the United States dollar, is at the very summit of the currency pyramid. And among the very few countries that could be described as having monetary sovereignty, we could count, for example, Japan, the United Kingdom, or Canada, perhaps China, but those are probably the only countries that have genuine monetary sovereignty. Other countries, although formally they might have monetary sovereignty, in reality do not do so. And an occurrence like the Great Financial Crisis of 2007, in which exposure to the United States dollar by the banking system, by the financial system, by the shadow banking system exposes the fragility of these peripheral currencies. So this raises an obvious problem. Obviously, the core periphery theory, in that sense, accommodates the theory of money. But the core periphery problem is obviously also a recursive problem, right? The core periphery dynamic is one which we can describe between, say, the global north and the global south, but we can describe it just as much within Latin America. We can find cores and peripheries just as much within Chile, between the richer areas of the country, for example, Santiago, and the more rural and agricultural areas of the country. We can even find core periphery dynamics within Santiago, for example, between the richer parts of the city and its more poor equivalents. Now, the standard theory of dependency has arguably rather little to say about the monetary dimension of this kind of core periphery dynamics. Typically here, the role to remedy this kind of core periphery dynamics is left to fiscal authorities. Fiscal authorities can dispose of unemployment benefits, for example, as automatic stabilizers to remedy these kinds of core periphery dynamics. And in cases of genuine emergency, fiscal authorities can also make use of discretionary spending in support of local government. But the message in many ways seems to be here that there is nothing monetary to be seen here. The primary role is left to fiscal authorities. Now, I believe that this is a significant oversight in the theory of money. And this is an oversight that is recognized by central bankers worldwide, that is often designated under the title of the one-size-fits-all problem. What does the one-size-fits-all problem designate? Well, it designates really the inadequacy of monetary policy to live up to the promises and to the objectives that central bankers themselves set out as the targets of their own policy. The one-size-fits-all problem designates, for example, the fact that inflation rates typically are not the same across different regions within the jurisdiction of a central bank. The Central Bank of Chile, for example, might find that on average the inflation rate within the country is, say, 2.5%, but obviously that statistic would hide significant discrepancies between inflation rates in different parts of the country. In other words, even if the Central Bank of Chile would argue that it is meeting its target, almost by definition, unless we're in the extremely unlikely scenario that inflation rates are going to be identical across all parts of its jurisdiction, therefore almost by definition, despite what the Central Bank of Chile might find in its own statistics, it will be missing its own target. So let's think about the implication of that for a second. In the call of this workshop, reference was made to the fact that we're thinking about the valuation of money, right? The one-size-fits-all problem designates the fact that ultimately, despite the fact that formally the value of the Chilean peso is exactly the same everywhere, legally speaking, across the country, in reality, because inflation rates will be different across the country, because real interest rates will be different across the country, the value of the Chilean peso is not the same in Chile's core and in Chile's periphery. That is a dynamic that we can observe at the global level, at the national level, at the regional level, even at the local level. In other words, money is more expensive in the periphery. It is harder to come by. It is cheaper in the core than it is in the periphery. And therefore, core periphery dynamics are ultimately also within the jurisdiction of a central bank. They are a monetary phenomenon. And that is the question that I want to explore with you today. Core periphery dynamics ultimately as a monetary dynamic which is caused by the institutional framework, the legal framework that creates central banks that are exploited by central banks. I believe that these core periphery dynamics in the tradition of the dependency theory that developed it constitute ultimately a challenge to the legitimacy of central bank action, and simultaneously core periphery dynamics could also be mitigated by central bank activity. And that is what I want to explore with you today. In order to do so, I'm going to make my argument in 3 steps. First of all, I want to give you a brief historical perspective of how I see this fitting into the role that historically central banks have played. Secondly, I want to address 2 objections. First of all, a significant technical objection, which is called the arbitrage problem. And thirdly, I want to address the obvious objection of the democratic legitimacy of central banks to address core periphery dynamics. So let's start with a brief bird's eye overview of the history of central banks. So I intend this as a sort of brief universal history of what central banks are doing. And we're starting off with the moment of the founding of central banks, if you like. So I believe that the moment of the founding of central banks can in many ways be conceived of as part of the process by which, as Max Weber argued, states are conquering a monopoly on the use of violence. That's a classical definition of what statehood implies in social theory. But of course, in monetary terms, states also attempt to conquer a monopoly on the emission of currencies, and central banks play a critical role in that story. Often at the time central banks are emerging, are founded, we are witnessing significant monetary pluralism, one might say, within the jurisdiction in which the central bank will ultimately start its activities. There are many competing banknotes in circulation, for example, typically in these kinds of scenarios, in a scenario that resembles really what looks like the free banking era in the United States. I am ignorant as to the specific history of Chile in this respect, but I can tell you that, for example, in France, in Belgium, jurisdictions with which I'm very familiar, this is exactly what happened. Italy, for example, is exactly the same story. This, of course, creates significant problems because the commercial banks that might be established in the core will be emitting banknotes that, as I just suggested, will ultimately be of higher value. Because they will be treated with greater deference by commercial actors in the system as a bank that has more prestige, closer to the core, has clients that are commercially more successful, and therefore ultimately more trust can be put in these banknotes. By contrast, the banks in the periphery will typically be in a much more difficult situation. The banknotes that they emit into circulation might be much less well regarded, might be harder to exchange with respect to banknotes emitted by banks in the core. In practice, therefore, this means that there's a difference in the valuation of money, quite literally, as they are emitted by commercial banks at the time these central banks are established. It means in practice very different interest rates as well, because it will be harder for commercial banks in the periphery to operate vis-a-vis commercial banks in the core. So it's in this context that we should understand the emergence and the establishment of central banks in many ways as a state-building exercise, as an exercise in creating uniform commercial conditions across a central bank jurisdiction. And I would argue this means that essentially the core task of a central bank at this moment of its creation is one of development, right? It is a task of seeking to establish conditions of equality among commercial actors, both in the core and in the periphery. It is a limited exercise to the extent that the equality policy that we're pursuing here is purely formal in many ways, but of course it's an absolutely critical exercise, right? The objective here is to ensure that the formal value of, for example, the Chilean peso will be exactly the same across the national territory. The idea is that the interest rates that will be demanded would ultimately also be equalized across the territory which the central bank is overseeing by means of the standard central bank policy tools with which we are familiar. So this, in many ways, is the origin story of central banks, an origin story which I would argue is quintessentially a story of development, quintessentially a story which seeks to establish the equality of states. And after that, what we witness is what one might call the first great globalization of the story of central banks, the 20th century, of course, being incontrovertibly the century of the rise of central banks. And I believe that this first story of globalization is intertwined with the Keynesian revolution, right? Keynes was the actor, the intellectual in many ways behind this first emergence, this first globalization of central banks. So it relied internationally on the Bretton Woods system, which assured that at the international level there would be a limited flow of capitals, between nations, which would allow in turn internally central banks to accommodate the cycle of boom and bust that so typifies capitalism. In this way, in Eichengreen's famous formulation, central banks can ultimately accommodate democracy, right? Because as we know, witness the Great Depression and what happened due to the Great Depression, for example, in the United States or in Germany, it is a significant democratic problem if a major recession causes significant unemployment. So, of course, Keynes was a critic of Bretton Woods in the way it was ultimately developed, but this guarantee of democracy remained, to some extent, preserved in the Bretton Woods system. And, of course, and perhaps the even more significant contribution of this Keynesian revolution is the unification of the technical framework in many ways of central banks in the way in which macroeconomic economists, and all of you who have studied basic economics class will understand this, are now understanding their job as one of targeting short-term interest rates. This was not necessarily clear at the founding moment for many central banks, but thanks to this globalized view of what macroeconomics entails, the job of central banks became clear. It is one of targeting short-term interest rates. So that is the moment of liberalism, the first moment of the founding of central banks. Now, I want to put this in perspective from a legal perspective by giving a brief intermezzo that will be familiar to the lawyers among you. So in making this presentation, I was thinking of this famous quote by Anatole France, which you might know. The law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. Now, obviously, this quote is a furious critique of the idea of formal equality. Obviously, the rich finding no need to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, or to steal bread. I believe that this quote typifies what lawyers across the globe, I believe, will understand as a moment of social legal thought, which characterizes law sometime between 1900 and 1968, according to the typology created by Duncan Kennedy and his famous three globalizations of law. And I think that lawyers from across the globe will recognize what we are talking about here. It is the emergence of the social welfare state, the creation of new areas of law which go beyond formal equality, which seek to establish a form of substantive equality by creating an area such as labor law in order to remedy the critical imbalance in the relationship between employer and employee, landlord-tenant law, which addresses exactly the same kind of inequality, consumer law, etc., etc. Within the hard kernel of private law, which was so characteristic of the individualism of the liberal era, we see the rise of open-ended clauses like the good faith clause, or open-ended terms like proportionality, in order to remedy this kind of formal equality. In other words, social legal thought is characterized by what one might call today positive discrimination, or precisely this move from formal to substantive inequality. Now, my question to you is, where does central banking, where does monetary law fit into this story? It seems to me that monetary law in many ways is lagging behind, and that the Keynesian promise that central banks can intervene in order to smoothen out the boom and bust cycle that is so characteristic of capitalism does not follow this line of moving from formal to substantive equality. And that one of the reasons it is failing to do so, and monetary theorists have paid little attention to this problem, right, is exactly the problem of dependency theory. It is the core periphery problem. And monetary theory has never been able, at least that's my contention, to come to terms with this problem. And as lawyers and political economists thinking about central banks, we need to worry about this problem. And so the story continues. Of course, after this brief intermezzo, we will hear much more about the second globalization of central banking this afternoon, at least the Chilean part of the story. Neoliberalism is undeniably the second globalization, I would say, of the model of central banks. We all know what its key characteristics are: an increasing emphasis on central bank independence, independence from politics, a narrowing of central bank mandates, which is now understood as solely a form of inflation targeting. Simultaneously, perhaps it's unclear in what way the causal direction would flow, the rise of financialization across the globe, which of course ultimately will lead to the implosion of the Bretton Woods system, and therefore the end of the first globalization and of the Keynesian revolution. Now, the most significant takeaway of this moment in time, of course, is that the neoliberal moment is completely antagonistic with respect to the original, the founding moment of central banks, in that the neoliberal moment clearly denies the role of central banks as actors of development of the nation state, right? That is no longer conceived to be part of the role of central banks. And so we come to the current moment, this difficult start of the 21st century, which I think we can describe as a post-neoliberal moment, right? A post-neoliberal moment in multiple ways, and Paula and Ignacio have invoked, I believe, the two core elements of this post-neoliberal moment, which of course starts, I think, from a global perspective with the great financial crisis of 2007, 2009, but of course continues, for example, with the COVID-19 pandemic and with the climate crisis that we are facing, right? Central banks are ultimately, during this moment, forced to bypass the financial system. The great financial crisis is a crisis, amongst others, of the shadow banking system. So central banks are forced to expand rather than limit on the Keynesian agenda of steering the business cycle, by opposition to the original Keynesian idea, in which a central bank would act simply as a lender of last resort of financial institutions, right? Central banks now become market makers of last resort, in the famous formulation of Perry Mehrling, in order to be able to step in and save not just the banking system, but also the shadow banking system, which has emerged as a result of practices of financialization ever since the neoliberal moment. Central banks must bypass the financial system. The same has happened, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic, in which central banks even more explicitly have stepped in order to provide helicopter money or direct support to governments, direct support to businesses, even direct support to individuals. This, of course, clearly upsets the neoliberal moment, and the intellectual founding, the intellectual structure, the legitimacy of central banking is called into question by these events in which central banks in many ways were forced to act in order to save the financial system. And of course the question which this raises is, does this mean that we're returning to this moment of founding, to this moment of the developmental model of central banks? Of course, Ignacio alluded to the other aspect, which implies that we've turned to the post-neoliberal moment. We were chatting just a few minutes ago about what the Trump administration is doing to the Federal Reserve chair in the United States. The post-neoliberal moment is also the result of the political moment which we're witnessing, I believe, in Latin America, in the United States, in Europe, in pretty much everywhere across the world. Liberal and technocratic institutions of all sorts, but also central banks, are under threat everywhere. The traditional technocratic, expert-based narrative of macroeconomics, of central banks, is under attack by the right, but also by the left in some instances. And this has already been called by Danny Roderick, for example, the post-neoliberal consensus. Right? The post-neoliberal consensus means that both the left and the right are worried about economic concentration. That's one element of it, but the other elements are perhaps more interesting to us. The post-neoliberal consensus means that at a political level, we are concerned about restoring dignity to those who have been left behind by the neoliberal moment. The Trump presidency undeniably tries to leverage this problem politically. And it also implies an open embrace of an active role of governments in order to be able to do exactly that, right? So this is part of what it appears to be the emerging recipe of the post-neoliberal moment. And once again, this raises the question for central banks, whether this implies a return to the founding moment, a return to the developmental model of central banks. So we are at a turning point in history. I believe that there's an inflection point which intellectually central banks must meet. Either we must return to the moment of technocracy, to the moment of liberalism that characterized the Keynesian moment and the neoliberal moment, or we must accept that central banks will need to continue this activist role which they have been forced into by events since the great financial crisis, and which politics is also forcing them into. So my diagnosis on this question is simple, and it links back to the starting point of this very presentation, right? Dependency theory and the core periphery problem are a key problem of monetary policy. It affects monetary value between core and periphery. This has always been a significant problem for central banks, for the legitimacy of capitalist systems, and as theorists of central banks, I believe it is a problem which we should tackle head-on because it basically creates significant risk for the social contract in a capitalist economy. The traditional liberal model obscures and reinforces these core periphery dynamics, I believe, and therefore my thesis is quite simple. We have no choice but to embrace intellectually the activist role of central banks if we want to continue to subscribe to a market model in which central banks play a significant role. And the corollary to that is that central banks must, as a matter of their mandate, counteract core periphery dynamics, and they should do so as a matter of social justice, right? Now, this sounds utopian and ideological. I believe that this is compatible with all of the different flavors historically that models of central banks have been subscribing to, right? It is obviously compatible with the developmental model of central banks. Under the developmental model, it would explicitly be the role of a central bank to ensure greater economic development of the periphery, but it is even compatible, I would argue, with the harshest interpretation of the neoliberal model of central banking, in which central banks should target purely and solely the inflation rate, right? In the way in which I have formulated the core periphery problem as a one-size-fits-all problem, it is apparent that the inflation rate is not, contrary to what central banks would have us believe, the same everywhere, right? The statistics might show us one number, but behind this one number, it is almost impossible that inflation rates will be the same across core and periphery within the regions of central bank jurisdictions. So even on the strictest interpretation of the neoliberal model of central banking, it is absolutely conceivable that central banks have an activist role to play in order to ensure that the value of money is identical everywhere and that the inflation rate is equalized across core and periphery. So there you have my thesis. I will now continue with two objections. First, a technical objection, and secondly, a democratic objection. So, a technical objection. The arbitrage problem. Everybody recognizes that central banks set monetary policy by defining an interest rate, right? That is a key component of the Keynesian revolution. This is the way macroeconomics is understood worldwide. This raises an obvious problem, right? Let's say that the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank or the Banco Central de Chile would set different interest rates within the same jurisdiction. What if the interest rate is different in Michigan, right? The state so critical to the Trump elections, the state housing Detroit, or in New York? What would happen, to give the European flavor of the same problem, if Greece, the quintessential problem child of the euro area, is subject to a different interest rate than Germany, always the first kid on the block in the euro area? I'm sure that you can come up with the equivalent problem in the Chilean context. The answer is plain and simple, right? If a central bank were to do this, we're basically handing free money to the commercial banks that are the direct interlocutors of central banks, right? What will these commercial banks do? They will quite simply borrow money from the central banks there where the interest rate is the lowest, for example in Greece, for example in Michigan, if the central bank allows them to do so, and they will lend out at a much higher rate there where the interest rate is higher, for example in New York, for example in Germany, and I'm sure that you can develop the equivalent in the Chilean context. So central bank policy of this nature seems futile and counterproductive. Either it stops because it is futile and counterproductive, or we keep handing free money to the commercial banks. Or not. So I believe that perhaps an understudied element of the recent evolution of central bank policy shows that this is not necessarily the case. And to do that, I'm going to zoom in on two perhaps less studied elements of the quantitative easing programs developed by the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve in the United States. So the key extraordinary measure adopted by the European Central Bank over the past decade and a half has been its resolution to the euro crisis. So the euro crisis in 30 seconds dealt quite simply with the fact that Greece, a member of the euro area, dealt with severe fiscal problems. We can have a debate about the origin of those problems, but that is not relevant for this discussion. The result of these fiscal problems were that financial markets priced in excessive risk premia for Greek bonds. This in turn meant that Greece could no longer roll over its debt, and it was at risk of bankruptcy. If Greece is at risk of bankruptcy, it might actually be more effective for Greece to leave the euro area, readopt the Greek drachma in order to be able to repay its creditors at a cheaper rate instead of going bankrupt. This created an existential threat for the euro area, because if Greece would indeed leave the euro area, what would happen if financial markets started to speculate that Portugal or Ireland might be facing the same difficulties? And if it could happen to Greece, Portugal, and Ireland, what if it would happen to Spain? What if it would happen to Italy? What if it would happen to France? And all of a sudden, there is no euro area anymore, because the three, well, apart from Germany, the three largest economies of the euro area would be under threat of exiting the euro area. The European Central Bank responded quite straightforwardly in a famous speech by ECB President Mario Draghi that the ECB would do whatever it takes in order to save the euro area. This was called the OMT program, and basically the ECB stated in public that it was willing to buy as many Greek bonds as necessary in order to put a floor under their prices, decreasing the interest rates and ensuring that Greece would not go bankrupt, would continue to be able to finance itself on financial markets. This means no more, no less than that the European Central Bank provided support for the periphery of the euro area. The ECB acted not only as under the traditional Keynesian formula as a lender of last resort of the commercial banking system, but also as a lender of last resort of a peripheral government. Right? As a critical note, it's important to add that this program was actually never put into practice. The ECB never bought a single Greek bond under this program. This was a pure play on expectations And as a result of this speech, financial markets quietened down immediately. The Federal Reserve did something very similar during the COVID-19 pandemic with its municipal liquidity facility. So as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, US local governments were expected to step in to provide support to their own communities. This created obvious risks for the fiscal capacities of local governments, of states, of counties, of cities across the United States. And so the Federal Reserve decided to intervene. The Fed was willing to support markets of these states, these counties, and these cities in cases they were confronted with fiscal problems. The Fed put in practice this program. Only Illinois and the New York Metropolitan Transportation System applied for this program. So its economic significance remains limited, but its point of principle remains just as valid. The Federal Reserve, much like the European Central Bank, provided emergency support to its periphery during the COVID-19 crisis. So this gives us an implicit explanation, an answer to the arbitrage problem, right? The new central bank paradigm is that central banks can act as lenders of last resort for local governments as a proxy for the periphery, and there is no arbitrage here because central banks are able to intervene in a sort of standard developmental model of central banks as by targeting specific local actors active on debt markets in order to have specific localized effects. Obviously, when the ECB intervenes to save Greece, this has a beneficial effect on the Greek economy. There's a long story attached to that, which we can have in the Q&A. And similarly, when the Fed intervenes in support of Illinois or of the New York Metro, this has obvious beneficial effects for Illinois and the New York system. There are regrettably also spillover effects due to globalization, right? It is perfectly possible for a major Japanese commercial bank, for example, to invest and speculate on the solvency of the Greek government, and such a Japanese bank would stand to gain significantly if the ECB intervenes, and the same applies, of course, to the bonds of Illinois and of the New York Metro. But the principle stands. Central banks, despite the arbitrage problem, have the capacity and the means to intervene in support of peripheries. And I would add, when local governments fail to live up to this duty, central banks can target prominent commercial regional actors in order to intervene directly in support of these peripheries, something which one might call regional quantitative easing, entirely in line with what central banks have been doing over the past 20 years. This raises a more fundamental problem, right? Basically, what central banks have been doing over these past 15 years is shifting the focus. If the classical Keynesian formula is to focus on short-term interest rates, what they've been doing is to focus on what is monetized as a critical aspect of their technical operations and as the key to unlocking this developmental role. So central bank interventions are obviously balance sheet interventions. We understand that central banks can print money, right? That means that they're creating liabilities. But if central banks want to print money, they need a correlative asset on the asset side of their balance sheet. And in ordinary times, typically this will be the liabilities of large commercial actors like primary dealers in the United States or large commercial banks in the euro area. These are the main models for central banks to act. And these IOUs are accepted by central banks against collateral. In extraordinary times, such as the Great Financial Crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, outright purchases by the central bank can replace that, right? This is part and parcel of the very essence, of the very core of what central banks do. And I put it to you that this is also the fatal flaw of the liberal, technocratic, neutral, politically neutral model of central banks. Central banks, because they must have a balance sheet, because they must have something on the asset side of their balance sheet, must respond to a critical distributive question. What is it that they will monetize? And, of course, that choice has deep redistributive consequences because the instrument that is chosen will be subject, its dynamics on the market will change because commercial actors will be subject to an incentive to acquire these kinds of instruments. because these instruments can be exchanged with the central bank for the highest powered money within the economy, right? So that means that the prices of these instruments will go up, the interest rate of these instruments will go down, and whoever emits this debt, whoever emits this IOU, is in a privileged position in the economy. The central bank cannot avoid making this question, answering this question, what will be monetized. It therefore makes critical redistributive questions, and therefore its role is also deeply political and unavoidably political. With that, we arrive at a second objection, right? So I'm suggesting that central banks should take an activist role in countering the core periphery dynamic. To what extent are central banks democratically legitimate to do this? Central bankers are typically today designated as experts and technocrats. They have limited democratic legitimacy, which is generally accepted precisely because they are expert. They are better than we are at understanding the macroeconomic dynamics of the economy, at interpreting inflation data, and understanding where we are at in the business cycle and responding appropriately. Yet I'm suggesting that they should act in support of the periphery. This has clear redistributive effects. So, where are we at? This raises, perhaps under a new light, the traditional question of coordination between monetary and fiscal authorities. I would argue that in the traditional liberal paradigm, resolving the core periphery problem was always a problem for fiscal authorities. And I would argue that we only need to make a minimal adjustment to this traditional liberal paradigm. So in other words, under the traditional liberal paradigm, if Greece or Michigan are on the verge of bankruptcy, it is either up to the European or to the American federal instances to intervene in support of local political authorities. This traditional liberal paradigm should be preserved, and central banks should intervene solely and purely as lenders of last resort, as an ultimate backup, in case first-line responders, the political actors, refuse to do so. Sorry. So, of course, as I just suggested, central banks must make a critical redistributive, must answer a critical redistributive question. What will they monetize, right? There are two broad philosophies when we look at comparative central banking worldwide in tackling this problem. Central banks typically will either monetize commercial paper emitted by significant commercial actors within the economy, for example, commercial banks, large businesses, or they will quite simply monetize the liabilities of governments, right? This raises the same critical distributive question that I've suggested before. What is monetized? The obvious implication is that we either have a very market-focused central bank, if it is monetizing the liabilities of large commercial actors, or we have a central bank that provides implicit support for political actors if the emphasis is put on the monetization of the liabilities of governmental actors. Now, I believe that given that the role of central banks is unavoidably political, they should stand behind their sovereigns and therefore monetize the liabilities of their own governments. It is fairly common for central banks to accept government debt on the asset side of their balance sheets. The euro area is perhaps the most extreme exception to this because of the peculiar nature of the euro area from a global perspective. The stakes of this question are, of course, whether we can consider a central bank ultimately to be an actor in support of democracies, or ultimately an actor that we can consider to be undemocratic in that it refuses to support the democratic actors, which is ultimately backing. So is it incompatible with the neoliberal model of central banks to provide this kind of support? I think that the answer is plainly no. First of all, because this occurs under a paradigm of monetary dominance in which central banks decide first what the inflation rate within the economy is and what the appropriate policy stance of the central bank should be, right? This is not the story of fiscal dominance in which central banks first decide how much money they're going to emit, and afterwards it's up to the central bank to monetize those obligations. No, the amount of central bank government debt that will be monetized is set solely by the central bank and purely in order to respond to the objective of the inflation rate. right? So we should not be giving in to Trumpian politics as we are witnessing them as we speak. Also, note that perhaps the quintessential example of the neoliberal model of central banking, the Federal Reserve in the United States, has adopted this very model, right? So it is compatible with the neoliberal model as it has been implemented by one of the world's foremost central banks. So I propose that we should make a minimal adjustment to this program. Central banks should accept federal government debt, sure, as most of them already do, but they should also accept local government debt on equal footing within their operational framework. This would act as an implicit stabilizer, right? Let's imagine that the state of Michigan risks going bankrupt. Let's imagine that Greece risks going bankrupt. Let's imagine that a Chilean province is at risk of bankruptcy. Implicitly, market actors would respond. Risk premia would increase. It would be harder for those actors to finance themselves on financial markets. And implicitly, automatically, this divergence would disappear because central banks would be willing to take these instruments even though they are bought and sold at lower prices, at more attractive prices for commercial actors, and being able to convert them into higher powered money at the same rate as much more expensive instruments. Now, the corollary of this, of course, and this will be the neoliberal objection, is that there is a risk of abuse by local government, but I believe that this is not a fatal objection because of the federal construction, because of the links between central governments and local governments. It's perfectly possible for central governments to intervene and sanction local governments that are overstepping their boundaries and abusing their fiscal privileges. In addition, central banks can temporarily withdraw their support for these local governments and local actors. In other words, what I'm proposing is an inversion of the paradigm that has been put into practice by the European Central Bank and by the US Federal Reserve. It is not in emergency circumstances that central banks should intervene in support of regional actors. They should be doing it by default, and only when it's been established that there are abuses by local governments should they be reversing course in consonance with actions by political actors that would be sanctioning those local governments. I think I started the presentation with a provocation, the idea that the core periphery theory, as developed by people like Raoul Prebisch, missed perhaps the monetary dynamics within central banks' jurisdictions. Let me finish with another provocation, right? If central banks are capable of taking into account the core periphery problem, of smoothing out these core periphery dynamics, we can leverage these abilities of central banks while we are awaiting Bretton Woods 2.0, the long-awaited reform of the international monetary system that could finally do away with the currency hierarchy that characterizes core periphery dynamics at the global level. If central banks can intervene in support of local governments, regional monetary unions can be an effective mechanism in order to counteract the deeply unfair dynamics of global core periphery dynamics. The traditional objections to regional monetary unions are those that have been addressed to the euro area as it stands today. The problem of the euro area is that it reinforces core periphery dynamics, as witnessed by the Greek crisis, that it is deeply neoliberal because it provides no support whatsoever for local government actors. And I believe that the model that I propose is an alternative model that does away with these objections. In other words, we can understand regional monetary unions as a form of cartelization, which would allow regional actors to coalesce their market power and to be stronger in global currency dynamics. So allow me to conclude. I've already overstepped my time. I believe that dependency theory quite simply misses out on the monetary aspects of core periphery dynamics within states, and that central banks are capable of responding to this as actors of development. They can and they should play a critical role in counteracting core periphery dynamics. This is common both to the model of the founding moment of central banks as to the model that we are witnessing today in the post-neoliberal moment. The reasons why I believe this is plausible is the fact that central banks inevitably make critical redistributive and therefore political decisions This is not just evidenced by the great financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, or the challenge of climate change. It is the very core of the question what a central bank is monetizing that raises this redistributive and therefore this political question. And if this is the case, I believe that progressives in the current political moment should respond to core periphery dynamics, which undeniably are fueling the political evolution that we are witnessing worldwide. Progressives should seek central bank support for peripheries as a means to counteract these political dynamics, and they should do so primarily by means of implicit support of local democratic actors. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Peter, por esa provocadora presentación y que nos deja pensando en la aplicación, digamos, en nuestro contexto latinoamericano. Vamos a abrir una ronda de preguntas. ¿Sí? Amanda es tesista de la Facultad de Derecho.
Hago la pregunta en español. Estaba pensando que con su modelo, finalmente, para traducirlo en algo práctico, tendría que haber a lo mejor un cambio de mandato del Banco Central. Entonces, mi pregunta era, primero, ¿cómo visualiza ese mandato? Si es que reemplazaría, por ejemplo, el mandato de la estabilidad de la moneda, que es como el mandato principal de todos los bancos centrales, y si es que, por ejemplo, no lo reemplaza, sino lo complementa, ¿existe algún tipo de priorización respecto del mandato de la estabilidad de la moneda? Priorización, como de efectivamente que la estabilidad de la moneda sea nuevamente lo más importante como funciona acá, a costa de los otros posibles objetivos o mandatos que el Banco Central podría tener. Como eso, cómo se traduciría en la práctica, más que nada.
Tomemos un par de preguntas. ¿Sí? Sebastián Salazar, de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. I will ask in Spanish, basically because I'm so much smarter in my native language, such as Sofía Vergara said, in a very funny situation. Tengo dos preguntas. La pregunta es, ¿cuál es el rol de las criptomonedas acá? What's the role of the cryptocurrency here? Because I missed this part in the presentation. Basically, I consider that the fact that cryptos is kind of disrupting topic in your model, or the highly excessive decentralization that cryptocurrencies creates, even trying to fracture the sovereignty currency in the state. And it's in English. Y la segunda pregunta es si avanzaremos o no a una nueva, con este rol del Banco Central, avanzaremos o no a una nueva manifestación de un capitalismo de Estado. Que de una otra forma Alami Dixon, en un tremendo libro que se llama The Spectre of State Capitalism, abordan diversas dimensiones de un capitalismo de Estado, un capitalismo estatal, y si veremos que el Banco Central hará un rol de estabilizador o volveremos a estas ideas desarrollistas de productivismo, que es algo muy característico aquí en América Latina, que fue con el boom de los commodities durante la primera década del siglo XXI y que eventualmente puede pasar ahora en el continente. Gracias.
Sí, bueno, soy Nicolás Delgado, de la Universidad Central, y tengo una duda respecto a la propuesta que, por ejemplo, porque cuando los bancos centrales quieren ayudar a gobiernos locales, por ejemplo, en Estados Unidos hay varios bancos públicos regionales, en cambio en Latinoamérica, o por lo menos en Chile, no hay bancos públicos regionales, solo uno central. Entonces, ¿a qué entidades estos bancos centrales apoyarían a nivel local? ¿Se apoyarían directamente a los gobiernos con recursos o a algún banco comercial que sea un poco más grande? ¿Cómo sería ese apoyo que se da desde los centros hacia la periferia? Esa duda me queda.
Puedes contestar y después tenemos otra ronda de preguntas que quedaron pendientes.
Entonces, la primera pregunta. So, if I understood the question correctly, yes. So the first question about the mandate and periodization of the history of money. So the question of the mandate seems to be absolutely essential. It's the most apparent and obvious legal question to be raised about the legal role of central banks. And yet, I think it is almost entirely irrelevant. So let me put it this way. As a scholar interested in the law and political economy of central banks, I would argue, and so perhaps this comes from my own critical tradition in law as well, I would argue that whatever mandate a central bank is given, all of the interesting redistributive political questions occur behind the scenes. Give me a central bank with a harsh neoliberal mandate targeting purely inflation measures. I believe that I can legally justify an extraordinarily activist central bank that intervenes in the most progressive developmental direction imaginable. I can also imagine a central bank operating on the basis of the same mandate, which would act in an extremely conservative, non-interventionist way. So I believe that all of the interesting questions are raised on the other side of the highly visible question of the mandate. And I think that the proposal that I'm making exemplifies that in the sense that, well, the European Central Bank has a pretty conservative inflation targeting mandate. There's a footnote to that. In appearance, the Federal Reserve has a much more progressive mandate. In reality, this debate is about the operational framework of central banks, in which they have large administrative autonomy as experts, as technocrats, to do what they deem best in order to fulfill their mandate. And that's where the interesting politics is happening. And so you're asking me a question about the periodicization of the history of money, of the history of central banks. I would say that here as well, perhaps the mandate as such is not so interesting. Ultimately, so there was a major dramatic legal shift, for example, in Europe at the time that the euro was created. Ultimately, on the ground, this changed very little because the operational frameworks of central banks remained virtually identical. So all of the significant political questions occurred, for example, after the creation of the euro with the great financial crisis, 10 years later, right? So I believe that also in terms of periodicization, this visible question of the mandate is actually not the most interesting one. What matters are often the individual politics of central bankers and of central bank organs in response to significant events. The second question, cryptocurrencies. So I have not addressed cryptocurrencies because I feel cryptocurrencies are plainly a flagrant attack on even the most formal form and limited form of monetary sovereignties which most countries across the globe have. I guess that for this reason, I haven't thought very much about the question of cryptocurrencies. I think I have a very stereotypical European view on this question. I think that Europeans look actually not so much as cryptocurrencies as a danger. The danger rather would come from stable coins, which would be linked to the US dollar because of where we are in the current geopolitical and geoeconomic circumstance, and that stable coins linked to the US dollar would be a means of exacerbating the currency hierarchy, which we are all familiar with. It's a way of assuring that the US dollar remains top dog and that there's no plausible way of responding to it. And I believe that it's actually a valuable response to think about regional monetary unions as a way of protecting and preserving monetary sovereignty, because the threat of stable coins is just more important in the context of limited monetary sovereignty. El capitalismo del Estado. So I come from a critical legal tradition, which would ask the question, capitalism of the state or what? right? So the idea of a capitalism that would not be linked to the state would, from my theoretical legal tradition, be a mirage, right? So even that something that looks like a capitalism that is as unlinked from the state as possible is ultimately rooted in law, to put it simply, and if it's rooted in law, it is rooted in state power. So as a lawyer who's interested in law and political economy, I have issues with these kind of conceptual distinctions. But yes, of course, plainly, I'm pleading for a form of capitalism of the state. I don't think that there's any plausible alternative to a capitalism of the state. The question is, what kind of capitalism of the state, and in particular, a capitalism of the state that would reinforce corporate free dynamics, or one that would not? The final question. So what kind of debt could the central bank buy? Should we think of large commercial banks? Should we think of public banks? What if there are no public banks? It seems to me that in most places, local governments will always be emitting debt, will have a place, a presence on the debt markets, and they are the most significant interlocutors. And it is significant that we pass by, that we leverage the activities of local governments on debt markets, because it's a means of supporting local democracy. And I think that central banks should act in support not just of their sovereign, but also of pluralistic government, of local government, of local democracy, and ultimately a form of democracy that is much closer to its citizens. So yes, why not intervene in support of public banks? Ultimately, that's also a way of supporting local democracy. The European Central Bank, for example, accepts a very wide range of collateral. I could perfectly well see an operational framework of a central bank that would accept both the debt of a centralized government and the debt of localized governments, as well as local public banks when they are available. Why not do this to commercial banks? Because obviously this raises a political question. Should a central bank intervene primarily in support of democratic actors or primarily in support of market actors? My sympathies lie with the former philosophy. And so I don't think it's an option that we should exclude, but it's an option that we should keep as a backup option for those circumstances in which these markets are not available to intervene in them, or the circulation of instruments would be insufficient in order to achieve the operational targets of a central bank.
Hi, Professor. Thanks so much for being here. I'm going to do my best to think in English, if that helps. I had two interrelated questions as I was trying to think through like the timeline of what getting us there would look like. The first is, to what extent does your vision is rely on a very robust fiscal federalism framework? Because my sense is that, at least here, I mean, the examples that you gave from the US and definitely from Europe, those are countries with very robust fiscal federalism frameworks. I'm not sure if we have the same framework here in Chile. So I'm trying to think, to what extent would that be possible here? So that's my first question. The second question has to do with the idea of like regional monetary unions. Because I think those things take time, and there's a lot of frictions that you have to resolve between different countries. Like, I don't see Chile and Argentina like coming up with a common currency anytime soon. I know Argentina and Brazil were speaking about it some years ago, and that was like a very narrow project. So in the meantime, is there anything that central, like local or state, sovereign state central banks could do by themselves to try to push back against the influence from the core? And by themselves, I'm thinking, one thing you could think about is like trying to get more or less foreign debt. So being indebted in your own currencies, one way to push back against, but that would require enlisting the fiscal authorities. So is there anything that the central banks by themselves can do to push back against like a core pressure from the core? I think those were my two questions. Thanks.
Thank you for this super interesting presentation. I'm very grateful to hear your thoughts on these topics. I have two. One is a suggestion, or yeah, kind of a question, and then a more empirical one. The first one is that you say that this is more theoretical. You say that Previch comes from the dependency approach. He was much more structuralist. I mean, there is a distinction between dependency theory and structuralism, and I think Previch is much more structuralist on that matter. And I'm saying this because I completely agree that in Previch's work, at least when he was at the CLAC or UNCTAD, there was no consideration of the monetary dimension of the current periphery. However, I think that since the 2000s, structuralism here in Latin America, in Chile, they've been put much more emphasis on the issue of monetary dimension of current periphery relations. For example, Esteban Pérez Caldentein, Matías Bernengo have been written widely about how the monetary autonomy of the core is one of the key dimensions of the current periphery problem, exactly trying to put a light on that blind spot that I think you correctly identified in relation to classic structuralism. So I think that would be one dimension, like the issue of peripheral financiarization that neo-structuralists have been writing a lot about that. Ghosh, Ocampo also about that dimension. I think your presentation is much more structuralist on that matter. That's one of the suggestions. And in relation to the issues of the development model of central bank, I think this is something that a lot of people maybe have already questioned you. What about the case of China? I mean, isn't that an example of a developmentalist view of the central bank? There is no like this clear autonomy between central bank and the executive power. The central bank actively intervenes in order to increase their productive capacities. They have been accused by the WTO and the US precisely because of that. So I don't know if you have some thoughts on the China example for a pro-developmental view of monetary policy.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Just a short question, Peter. Thank you so much for your interesting presentation. I was thinking that usually we think of central banks linked to monetary policy, and it may be general, but there's also not just the interest rates, but also the exchange rate policy that is also linked to monetary policy. And here in Chile, it was a key moment when we decided, or the central bank decided, to move to a free floating exchange rate within the inflation targeting regime. So I don't know if at the EU level you have the same issue about it, because that's another way that the central bank clearly makes a distributional choice, especially when they intervene, or when they decide not to intervene in the exchange rate markets. And also linked to the debt question, that I also think that it's very interesting to think about the banking system as a whole, that we have moved to a commercial banking system, and I believe that there's like a whole history of having public banking, not just in Europe, but also in Chile. But what about like intervening, as you said, and I agree, like more developmental choices through the central bank, but also it makes the public debt goes higher, and especially for emerging economies, that's a critical issue, because we depend also on rating agencies that they put us, and that depends on like the government access to foreign markets and everything. I don't know if that makes sense, but thank you so much. I'm going to pass the microphone.
Gracias. Thank you. Okay, so the first questions came from Ignacio, I believe, and so you raised the question: how significant or established fiscal federalism frameworks in order to accommodate this kind of action by the central bank? What if there isn't much of a fiscal federalism framework? Is that problematic? And you suggested that both the United States and the European Union have very clearly marked fiscal federalism frameworks. This is a great question. I haven't thought about it very explicitly, but my gut reaction is to disagree with you that the fiscal federalism frameworks in the United States or in Europe are actually that established. And here I'm relying on, let's call it a Schmittian analysis of fiscal federalism. So my point would be, when you say an established fiscal federalism framework, you would expect some sort of clear set of rules that would always be adhered to. In my experience, those rules might exist, but the rules are tested at a time when the system of fiscal federalism is in crisis. This occurred in the United States in, I believe, the 1830s, when states were massively trying to set up canals, were investing in railroads, et cetera, and they were confronted with massive statewide bankruptcies as a result. The same thing happened in the European Union, of course, with the Greek story. And the lessons that we can draw from these stories are quite simple. The rule book is thrown in the bin. Perhaps the lawyers are requested to explain why whatever is happening is compatible with the rule book. But basically, this is a matter of emergency politics. And so I think that the Schmittian idea that sovereign is he who rules in times of exception applies fairly well to fiscal federalism frameworks. Because there is no set of rules that will, completely and mechanically dictate what needs to happen in such times of crisis. That's my belief when I look at these fiscal federalism frameworks. It even applies to the great financial crisis in the context of the United States. Ultimately, there were, I believe it was Illinois and even California, if I'm not mistaken, that was on the brink of bankruptcy. Formally, there was no bailout, but the Obama stimulus package ultimately provided support for local communities in such a way that it didn't ultimately matter whether California or Illinois went bankrupt, because there was support from the federal government anyway, and so the material consequences on the ground were limited as a result. Regional monetary unions obviously are major political headaches. The kindest thing that we can say about them is that they take time. Is there anything that central banks can do in the meantime? Yes, I think that they are. So the idea of regional monetary unions is really a utopian idea. It also has obvious neo-colonial implications when a European comes to plead for regional monetary unions in Latin America, implications which I resent. I nevertheless believe that it's an important intellectual question to raise into debate. Central banks can still do other things simultaneously. So one thing that flows from this presentation is the shift of focus from the short-term interest rate towards other things. And this actually takes us back to the heterodoxy at the time of the original Bretton Woods model, the original Keynesian model. The works of the French economist Éric Monnet are absolutely fascinating in this regard, because he explains how France was actually heterodox. With respect to the Keynesian model, the French central bank refused to focus on the short-term interest rate, and in practice, the French central bank had multiple targets. It had a target with respect to the domestic housing market, and it also had a target with respect to the French exchange rate, and it simultaneously had a target with respect to the agricultural market. So this is also an idea that is coming back up with respect to climate change, right? We need to think about the law and political economy of central bank operational frameworks, because they hold the key to differentiated policies in function of our political objectives, right? And I believe that the shift of focus away from the interest rate is absolutely critical in getting us there. Thank you for your remarks on Prebisch, on structuralist theory and dependency theory. I'm not going to pretend like I have a decent answer to this. I've come here to learn more, and one of the things that I want to learn much more about is dependency theory. So I would be very interested in shooting you an email and learning more from you about this. The other question that you raised was that with respect to China. So China is obviously a fascinating model for those who are interested in heterodox central banking. It is not a model which I would espouse. I think that the current political climate that we are witnessing, the Trump presidency in the United States and what has been happening over the weekend, is a dramatic threat to our well-being as citizens. I do not think that the Chinese political model, despite the virtues it might have in terms of development economics, is something that I would applaud ultimately as a citizen. So I would describe my own philosophy as that of perhaps, I'm inspired here by the work of the Brazilian philosopher and legal writer Roberto Unger as a sort of radical liberalism. I think that what we need is not less protection for central banks, but perhaps more protection for central banks. Because I believe that more protection for central banks might allow them to engage in more activist politics of the kind that can intervene in support of democratic policies. And that is what we need. So I do not think that the way forward is reducing the autonomy of central banks at all. Finally, the final question about, exchange rate policy, obviously. So the question of free-floating exchange rates is obviously absolutely critical. It raises a dramatic distributive question between favoring global capital or favoring basically domestic political priorities. So Europe has a very peculiar history in that respect, because when the Bretton Woods system imploded, we've been trying to ride both of these waves simultaneously by, to again use Schmittian terminology, delaying the ultimate decision between choosing for global capital or choosing for domestic imperatives by creating some sort of European monetary system in which we pretended like we could do both simultaneously, and of course we couldn't, because the system kept crashing. My response would basically go in the same direction as what I responded to Ignacio. I think that what is interesting for us as people interested in the law and political economy of central banks is to shift away from the way in which this question is raised. And this question is raised in this specific way because of the trilemma, and the trilemma exists because of the Keynesian focus on the interest rate. And so we need to learn to study the operational framework of central banks to understand that central banks can actually perfectly well do multiple things simultaneously. And examples such as the Municipal Liquidity Facility and the OMT program in Europe lead the way. It is perfectly possible for a central bank to have a targeted, localized intervention in support of domestic political priorities, while simultaneously only threatening to a minimal extent the openness of an economy to global capital markets. And I think that's significant. Risks of public debt are, of course, dramatic for the periphery. There are many risks attached to that. I believe that this kind of, again, so the answer would be intellectually the same. Studying the central bank operational framework and its multiple opportunities, its ability to actually strategically prioritize different objectives, make it possible for a central bank to defend the limited monetary sovereignty that a country in the periphery might have by intervening in support of centralized debt markets or localized debt markets, while simultaneously ensuring that the flow of global capital remains relatively steady, and that we're not witnessing, to cite a stereotypical example, the kind of attack that capitalists like George Soros might launch against the Bank of England at the time in which they're precisely juggling domestic imperatives and the imperative of respecting the rules of global capital. That would be my answer.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Peter, por una excelente presentación y una... Y ahora los invitamos a un café que tenemos.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for being here. I sure enjoyed it. I think that in the technical role
Sí.
I've just resolved into yes, that makes it double. Maybe I still prefer file. Thank you very much.
Directo.
Como moderador, ponemos cientos, lo ponemos en la silla, acá lo ponemos.
¿A quién?
Sí, porque estoy pensando para ordenar el... Hace falta una silla. Serían 5 sillas, o podríamos poner 4 y que vaya la persona presentando.
Sí.
Sí,
No, yo me voy parando sentando.
Ya.
Ponemos los 4 acá.
Ya, entonces está.
Se pasaron chicas, son chicas.
¿Esta agua?
Esta es mía, sí.
Ya.
Gracias. Hola, Victoria, soy Ignacio.
Claro, mañana.
Ah, ¿tú estás mañana?
Sí. Mañana en la mesa con Seba y con Matías Lilo. Así que yo creo que igual va a ser la mesa más...
Pero está ahí urgida.
Sí, hoy día es porque es muy específico en eso, pero...
Déjame ver para tirarte alguna idea. Está ahí mañana
En las 11.
a las... No, 11:30. Aquí está ya. Mira, de partida una mesa amplia.
Sí.
Porque yo no cacho a Matías Girov a...
Matías Giro solamente va a hablar con la administración. La administrativa.
Ah, pero mira el título.
¿Cierto?
Legal and Political Foundation.
No sé, igual que por eso creo que esta mesa es como la hippie del...
Sí, yo lo tengo que tirar.
No, si yo tengo el rollo listo. Si
Ah,
el tema es que,
no,
es que yo le decía...
¿Cómo lo recibes por el otro lado?
No, pues imagínate que vamos a estar este libro.
¿Pudiste?
Sí,
la cosa, ya.
igual
Ahora
hoy día
sí,
voy a... Porque cuando hablemos del libro voy a tratar de llevar la conversación así entre los baños, pero no...
Ya. Me quedo tranquila.
No, pues sí, ya no hay.
A la profe no sé si podía ir a volver.
Es que estaba tomando una. Eso no lo ocupó, estoy segura. Creo que esa
No
era...
sé, ese es de Ignacio, el computador es de la profe.
Ah, ya. Estoy tratando de mover.
Y dice, mira, se escucha de acá.
Sí,
Entonces a lo mejor no van a necesitar.
están prendidos todos. Pero eso igual déjalo ahí para que lo use quien...
¿Cómo se van a parar?
Ya ahí se acomodan. Ha faltado un agua. Nada, ya no.
Esto voy a correr hacia acá, porque ahí está el primer giro, aquí el segundo.
Claro.
Si no hay filo que estén desordenadas la hoja, la profe, este giro. Excelente.
Ya. Las aguas sí.
Para que no se vea tan...
Yo estoy muy... ¿Y esta?
Ese es del moderador.
Ah, ya.
La voy a dejar ahí solo para que se vea. Voy a sacar el PPT.
Ahí tienes.
Compartir pantalla.
Ahí bien. Sí.
No, es Nike Mijal, Clemente Segovia.
No, no, no.
No. ¿Dónde eran otros?
Ay, mi espalda.
Ya, ninguno de estos es. Veamos si es que... A lo mejor solo descargaron dos.
Quizá...
Porque el mail la profe. Sí, porque a lo mejor este va a tener otro... Qué miedo. Decirle a la profe que tiene su mail abierto.
Sí.
La presentación... Ya, no me quiero chatear. Demasiado, me da vergüenza. Así que eso y... ahí le podemos preguntar qué fondo de pantalla ponemos.
Quizá el banner.
Muy bien.
Se pasaron.
¿Qué ponemos de fondo de pantalla para el siguiente?
Eso, es que no sé si... No, vamos a ver cuántos participantes.
Había una persona más parecida.
Yo lo dejaría...
¿Y está su mail abierto por si acaso?